Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Will Coleman on globalization and autonomy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, and every week I welcome a noted expert in some aspect of global governance here to the studios of the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Will Coleman, who's the CIGI Chair of Globalization and Public Policy at the Balsley School, and my colleague in the Department of Political Science also at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Will.
Thank you.
Will, globalization and autonomy are both big amorphous concepts, so perhaps before we get too deeply into either or both, we could chat a bit about what they mean. Globalization is one of those words that we all use, and maybe that gives us the illusion that we all understand it the same way.
Right.
What's your sense of the scope of that term and what you denote by it when you use it?
Yes, well, the term concept of globalization is a bit of a moving target, so how you define it has varied over time. When I first began research on it, there was an idea that globalization somehow was a development that was going to shrink the power of states, that was going to increase the power of markets, and so that particularly economic flows, but maybe also social and cultural flows would go easily around the world. And that kind of thinking about globalization emerged in the early 1990s. Francis Fukuyama, for example, an American scholar, was one of the people who wrote along those lines. Not surprisingly, in the academic environment, whenever you get something like that, there's a little bit of pushback. And so the first challenge to that kind of thinking about globalization came from some historians and economists who did some careful analysis of statistics and argued, well, it's not so unusual that the period in the world between 1870 and 1914 was actually pretty globalized, if this is what you're talking about. It was a little bit different and so on. And so those were the kinds of debates that we faced when we first began to think about doing research in that area. I think that eventually I would call a kind of an intermediate position developed where people, and I think the best definition of it came from a political scientist, Jan Art Schulte, who was at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, and he argued that globalization was the growth of transplanetary connections among people. And so the key word in the first part of that definition is this word transplanetary. So we're talking about connections that are really potentially anywhere in the world. And then he added a clause to that definition, which he said an increasing number of which are supraterritorial. And what he meant by that complicated term, supraterritorial, was that those connections between people were not as easily controlled by states as they were before. Mm-hmm. So if we think of something like the internet and how people can connect around the world through the internet, or we talk about the flows of banking, you can see how this can be supraterritorial in the sense that it's very difficult for government to control. If you take something like the price of the Canadian dollar, it doesn't really matter where you buy it. It could be in Melbourne, Hong Kong, Toronto, London, New York, Tokyo. It's going to be about basically the same, which tells you again that the states don't really have a lot of control over that. So that was the kind of debate that went on. Now autonomy, which is the second issue, that came up in our project because when we began to look at the protests against globalization that began to emerge in the mid to late 1990s, if we look at let's say the debates that took place over the World Trade Organization in Seattle in the late 1990s, in looking at it, we thought that some of the core of this debate was autonomy. And autonomy, one, about our countries going to be able to control their destiny if we look at this new trading regime. That was one thing, but it was more than that. I think that people were worried about their own personal individual autonomy. Am I going to have control over the important things in my life or not? And so the project that we began to be interested in grew out of that problematic at that particular time.
Now, different things can be globalized. So
Right.
you can have, for example, ideas become globalized, attitudes, values, things can become globalized. I assume that implies a sort of homogenization of some kind.
I think that in the first debates about globalization, there were a lot of assumptions made about homogenization, that the increase in flows of all of those things you mentioned, culture, social relationships, political, economic things, would lead to homogenization. But actually, academically, that position was almost immediately challenged, and it came from different sources. But I think the most prominent sources were anthropologists,
Mm-hmm.
who were looking at, well, what happens, they would say, in a particular place when global flows come in. I mean, what happens is, do they all get, do all people end up being the same? And the answer was no. There's actually pushback. That people
Pushback or sort of increased complexity of
well,
ideas.
there was some increased complexity, but what it tended to do in the, let's say, the cultural area in many instances was to actually reinforce the sense of local culture.
Right.
Because there were feelings in many places that they were going to lose something here.
Mm-hmm.
And so you actually see increasing cultural diversity and assertion of difference that came with globalization. And again, that wasn't really something perhaps initial statements about globalization expected.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that you can track that pretty well.
And the threat to autonomy was a loss of an ability to make decisions about one's life, or a dislocation of one's sense of self. Which of those, or both, were politically most salient?
I think that the first one was certainly important, that is dislocations about, or the capacity to make decisions about how you're going to live your own life. I think that was important, at least in the individual sense. But I think also the idea of holding on to a set of cultural practices, a set of beliefs, and so on and so forth, was also pretty important for people. Which then, moves it up a little bit and talks about, well, what about communities?
Mm-hmm.
Are communities going to be absorbed into bigger communities? And what about states? Will states still be able to protect us? And so there was a literature that developed around that time that said that globalization was going to lead to the end of the welfare state, for example.
Fascinating. Well, we'll continue our conversation in a moment with Will Coleman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, Will, you mentioned that you've been involved in a project on globalization and autonomy, and my understanding is it was a fairly long-running and large-scale international project. Perhaps
Yes.
you can give us a sense of the scope and who was involved and when it was operating and what the outputs have been.
The project is on globalization and autonomy, so we're looking at the idea of globalization along the lines we just talked about. We're also looking at autonomy in both that individual person sense and the nation state or cultural community sense. So to deal with the complexity of all of the issues coming out of that, we had to put together an interdisciplinary research team. And we drew from a number of different disciplines. In the social sciences, we had sociology, economics, political science, anthropology, religious studies, and also from the humanities, we had historians, a fairly large group of literary scholars, and a couple of philosophers. And so the idea then was we'd bring that kind of mix of expertise into play. But we also thought to get a good picture at these issues, we had to have an international team, so that we ended up having scholars from 14 different countries. And we also had a partner research team based in Tunisia that also had scholars from Lebanon and Jordan on the south shore of the Mediterranean, and on the north shore from France, Italy, and Spain. And so our hope then was with such a large research team that we might be able to focus in on these things. As the director of the project, however, I will say that this was not an easy task.
Right.
You will know.
Herding
David,
cats,
working herding cats is exactly right. It's very difficult to do. And then when you have different disciplines in play, that was also hard because we had to work in an interdisciplinary way. That is, we had to work together even though we looked at the world differently. And there were some lessons we had to learn to do that. The most important one was respect. That is that if you're a literary scholar, you have to respect what a social scientist is saying, and vice versa. And I remember a debate that we had very early on in the project where there was a literary scholar, and she was talking about ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, because her research was really about short stories being written by Sri Lankan authors. And a social scientist stood up and said, "You can't talk about ethnic conflict. Everything you know about ethnic conflict, you're borrowing from us."
So that, as though that were a bad thing.
Yeah, it was a bad thing, but also that she really had no legitimacy to actually even talk about this. That really it was up to social scientists. So
proprietary concept.
Yeah. So when I talk about respect, I had to deal with this because people can't work together unless they respect one another. So it posed.
How did that work out?
It worked pretty well. I mean, I just had to set down a rule. The next time we met as a full team, I always gave a speech at the beginning of the thing, and I talked about respect, and that we had to go ahead. And actually, those two scholars ended up getting to know each other quite well and working together on the same book.
Very good.
In the project.
Yeah. How many years did the project run, and is it finished now?
The project's finished all except for one person, which is me. But the project began in April 2002, and I think the last of our books was, the substantive book was published just this year, 2011. And we still have one synthesis volume that I'm doing with two other team members that will kind of look back on the whole process to come, and who knows when that will be done. So it went over close to a decade when it all comes down to it. But in the last 3 years, it's really just been myself and a couple of other assistants bringing it all together.
And did the project itself evolve as it progressed, or did you, at the end of the day, do essentially what you thought you would be setting out to do in 2002?
No, the project did evolve, David, because we had some preliminary ideas when we made our application about what the themes would be. But in fact, by the time we began doing research and then got to the point of a discussion, which would have been around 2003, 2004, about what we wanted to write, a series of themes had emerged that we hadn't anticipated. For example, we had anticipated one on institutions, international institutions, but it really broadened out into a notion of global ordering. We hadn't necessarily thought about one about legitimacy, but that one really emerged out of a lot of the political scientists and historians working on it, and so we have a book called Unsettled Legitimacy. We also initially hadn't planned a strong research group on indigenous peoples, but it turned out that a lot of the issues with globalization are concentrated in a way indigenous communities feel these challenges on globalization and particularly autonomy, collective autonomy, very intensely. And so we brought in, actually for that, we brought in some additional indigenous scholars from South America who participated in the team and who also wrote chapters in that book at that point to help bolster that.
Very good. Well, maybe we'll talk more specifically about some of these themes in a moment when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Will, perhaps we can talk about some of the themes that interested you most personally as the project leader, somebody who really has a strong interest in trying to wrestle these concepts to the ground. Of the various themes the project looked at, which ones were most engaging for you?
I think the two that were most engaging for me, David, were the one on indigenous peoples, and we have another book that came out on what we called the theme of property, territory, and globalization. And I think that both of them were interesting because, in a way, that kind of research hadn't been anticipated at the beginning. And but gradually, as people began to do research on globalization, to understand it, I think people began to look for flashpoints where there were particular conflicts that highlighted some of the key issues we were thinking about in globalization and autonomy, and the issue of the particular situation of indigenous peoples across the world. We really focused on the Americas and Australia and New Zealand in our project, but there were a number of particular conflicts that we looked at. For example, one of the chapters looked at a little bit of a different angle than people normally think about indigenous peoples, and that was the struggle of indigenous peoples in Australia over control of water, the oceans, not so much over land, because they were essentially a sea living group who fished and so on and so forth. And so instead of putting a claim over land, they were putting a claim over water resources, which was a very difficult conflict in Australia, but I think, again, highlighted the challenges of globalization and how people thought of the sea and its international waters and so on and so forth as movement for shipping things around the world. That way, and then the indigenous people had a completely different vision of it. It was part of their habitat.
Right.
And so that conflict highlights some of these difficulties in globalization and autonomy. And then another one that came out was here in southern Ontario in New York State, where there were two indigenous communities in contemporary times who had long since moved off their traditional lands, who had lost their traditional lands, which is oftentimes the case. But they had put in claims for it and went through the processes, one in the US and one in Canada, and they received compensation for their losses. What did they do then with the compensation? They bought land. They bought back, actually, some of the land that had originally been theirs, and they bought back land that was nearby that wasn't. And that led to a tremendous backlash in the non-native communities in both of those areas, where some of the stereotypes about indigenous peoples, they don't know how to manage land properly, the water will get contaminated. A whole series of stereotypes came out. And so one of our scholars and anthropologists, she looked closely at that. So these kinds of struggles in particular places highlight, again, the global dimensions, because what was going on in that particular, those two communities, for example, was a global notion of property rights, originally a Western notion that had become globalized, and with that coming in conflict with a different understanding of property, even if they would, Native people wouldn't even use the word property because they don't think of land as somehow being separate from them. They see everything as integrated. And
is that true globally? Indigenous peoples around the world would have that attitude toward land?
Variations on that, but at least in our book and the things we've established, some of the common universal ideas we have. For example, we talk about nature all the time. Mm-hmm. But in most indigenous languages, there's no word for nature. Because the word nature implies that there's some kind of definition between human beings and other beings, including plants and animals. And they don't see it that way.
Is it safe to assume that from an indigenous people's perspective, globalization is essentially always a problem, always a threat?
No. What has been interesting about globalization in indigenous peoples is that, if you want to say a positive side of globalization, is that globalization in communications, for example, and globalization, the development of global institutions like the United Nations, have created avenues for indigenous peoples to come in touch with one another. Mm-hmm. And you have to remember that these people were in their particular areas. They knew nothing up until the 70s. from many of them, about indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. So it was really a process of discovery that began to take place through the United Nations that led to global relationships between indigenous peoples, and they would argue that that's been very positive. And it culminated in 2007 with a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that dealt with many of these issues about culture and about land and about language and so on and so forth that are common to indigenous peoples in most parts of the world.
And has it increased the sense of autonomy? Increased the satisfaction with the ability to make one's own life decisions?
I don't know if I would say it's increased a sense of autonomy. What it has increased is a sense of mutual support in those struggles, that you're not alone. And that maybe, therefore, it's useful to talk to one another and talk about strategies for dealing with problems that are similar.
And what about relations between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples? Is globalization taking the edge off that, sort of reducing the ease with which people reach for stereotypes and encouraging a kind of effort at real communication and adjustment?
I think indigenous peoples would say no, because the economic side of globalization has accelerated some of the processes that are most harmful for indigenous communities. For example, the search for natural resources. Right. And so in a way, I think that for indigenous peoples, and that's for them, they have a long historical view of globalization. Globalization isn't something that just happened in the past 20 years, because these processes that have become more intensive, the search for natural resources and so on and so forth, the displacement of people off lands, those kinds of things are not new, but they're more intense. And the challenges to their own culture are actually more intense too, because they're no longer as isolated as they once were.
Right. Well, fascinating. We'll be back again with Will Coleman to talk further about globalization and autonomy. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So we're now in the middle of a fairly acute economic crisis that many people blame squarely on globalization. Europe is undergoing a serious strain in its ability to service its sovereign debt, and of course, most of the economic indicators are not looking great. And fear is that globalization is resulting in this contagion. Of course, is immediately raising political issues. Right. So globalization is now back in the political pages of the newspapers as a subject of political conversation. What's your read on that?
Well, this is a very interesting thing, a set of developments to look at from globalization. And let me just back up a little bit. When we first started the project, as I said, the early thinking about globalization was the state would decline in importance. That over time, economic arrangements would disappear. And we got our research grant, and the September before we started research, the attack on the towers in New York had happened. And that, of course, prompted a very strong response by states, particularly the United States and others, around the ideas of security, things that you look at. So I remember some members came in and said, do we need the project anymore because globalization's over? Because you had seen a reaffirmation of states. But I think that what we learned in thinking about that is that what the state's role is in globalization hadn't been thought through very well. And I think the scholar who has influenced me the most in thinking about this is a woman named Saskia Sassen. And she argues that it's a bit deceptive. Yes, the states look the same. We still got states, they still seem to be doing important things. But she says that parts of states have become denationalized. And that is, what she means by that is that there are parts of the state that still look the same, but are actually part of a global governance system. And I'll give the easiest example to understand. And that is related to this area of finance that you talk about. So in Canada, we have a central bank, the Bank of Canada, and we have a finance department in the federal government, and so on and so forth. Now, if you ask yourself what the governor of the Central Bank of Canada does now, and you compare it to what he did 20 years ago, you'll see it's very different. Because he's basically working most of the time with his fellow central bankers around the world.
Right.
And his most important meetings are the ones every month where he goes to Basel, Switzerland and meets with other central bank governors. And if you look at the people in the Department of Finance in Canada who are responsible for banks, 20 years ago, if you asked them the question, and I did, how many people in your office work with the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which is a global organization working on banking regulation? He said one. And then I went back there in 2002, the same person. And I asked him how many are in the Office of Supervision of Financial Institutions in Canada, how many are working on these things now? And he said 25. 25. So that's a part of the Canadian government, two key institutions, the Department of Finance, that are really no longer working on Canada. They're working on global markets and global
because Canada's more exposed.
Yeah. But I think that what she's saying with that notion of denationalized, there are different parts of the state. And other scholars have written about the networks of meetings that take place between civil servants, between regulators, and so on and so forth regularly now. And there's a lot of research on it. So what's happening is that physically the state looks the same, it's got the same name, the same government name, departments, and so on and so forth. But increasingly there are parts of that state that are really not just working on the country, but they're working with other countries because they can't deal with the issues that they're concerned about without it. And the one that's most evident about that is the environment, climate change.
Is this inherently a good or a bad thing? I mean, there were the 19th century British economists and philosophers who said that this would be the best of all possible worlds. Right? The Manchester School people said the more you integrate politically and economically, the less likely conflict is, the less slaughter and mayhem there will be.
I think that there's a need for those kinds of things, but it does raise another problem that we dealt with in one of our books, and that's legitimacy. So as you get more and more government officials working almost behind closed doors with one another in different forums, the question is, where does accountability come in?
Right.
How do we ensure, as citizens of Canada or any other country, that in fact these people are taking into consideration our concerns? So once you begin to move to that kind of level of global governance, you raise questions, well, how do we know that the things that they're doing are right and proper?
Right.
Which means how do we know that they're legitimate? And that's why one of our books is entitled Unsettled Legitimacy, because globalization has really raised issues about accountability, legitimacy, responsibility, transparency, all of the things that we might take as given in the nation-state setting, but which aren't well thought out or developed at the global level.
Important hallmarks of good governance, transparency, accountability.
Right.
Thank you, Will, for coming in and talking about your project and sharing your insights, and we hope to see you again here.
Okay.
And thanks to the audience for joining us. Please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.